Hello everybody, this is a video about adding and subtracting fractions. Please make a note as you go through this video and keep that with the other fractions notes that you might have. Please remember, since it is video, you can always pause it or go back or something if you need to review what I've said. Now, before we get started, it would be a great idea if you had done some of the review that we've done before. The first one was not required review, but if you had any trouble with finding lowest terms or equivalent fractions, it may be a good idea to do that. So those were the optional review puzzles from last week. It would also be a great idea for you to do the review that I've assigned for this week, the review puzzles rather for this week, which cover comparing fractions a little bit, especially common denominators. That part's going to be very important for us today, and improper and mixed fractions. Okay, that won't come up as much in this one. I'm going to be sticking just to improper fractions when it comes up. But you will need to be comfortable with those as well as we go forward. Just one quick note, if you find this particular thing tricky, this does happen to be, the adding and subtracting fractions does tend to be one of the trickiest parts of the fractions unit, so don't feel bad if you do find it tricky. Multiplying and dividing is actually much easier, and we'll do that next week. Okay, on we go. Here's our learning goal for the week. Again, you don't have to write it down, but I would like you to write down a title and a date on the note that you're making right now. I trust that you are making a note. If you're not making a note, start making a note. You don't have to write down the learning goal, and our point is to add and subtract fractions with common and different denominators. Okay, so we'll keep moving on. Now, these are just a few different ways of representing it, but when denominators are the same, adding is very simple. Okay, all you need to do, and in our picture representation up here, we've got 3 out of 8 plus 2 out of 8 would equal 5 of these boxes. And you'll probably notice I've got the same. Ignore that they look like Z's. I'm trying to fill in the boxes here. It's just hard to do. So 5 out of 8. Okay, and hopefully you'll notice that the numbers right here are exactly the same. So the point being here is that when you're adding together denominators, or sorry, adding together fractions rather, that have the same denominator, your answer is just the same as if you had added the top two. Your denominator does not change. I'm going to take some time and write that very badly right here so it will stick in your memory. The denominator does not change. And hopefully you will remember this from the improper and mixed fractions stuff we did last week, where the same thing happens. The denominator does not change. Let's put a bunch of underlines under that just so that we get the idea. Okay, because I want you to make sure, and an exclamation mark, and an angry face, just to make sure everyone gets what we're doing. Angry face, no changing denominators. So when we have fractions, again, so you just add the 3 and 2 to get 5. You do not add the 8 and the 8 to get a denominator of 16, because just like you can see in the picture representation here, it doesn't really make sense to increase the number of empty boxes in this question. Then we haven't really added anything. We've actually made the fraction smaller. Okay, now I've grouped adding and subtracting into the same lesson because the process is exactly the same. You do exactly the same thing when you're subtracting, except you subtract instead of add. I know that sounds silly, but denominators stay the same, and you just leave them just as is. Okay, so we do 11 minus 9, which equals 2. Okay, but again, denominator stays the same. No changing of the denominators as long as they're the same to start with. This is the easy part, so I hope everyone's still with me. All right, now on the next page, we will talk about what happens when the denominators are different. That's where things get trickier. Okay, so please write down these steps as we go. And there's one extra note that I'll make, but I'll make it in a moment. So the first thing you have to do when the denominators are different is you need to find a common denominator. Okay, and we did this last week when we were comparing fractions. So you should have a bit of practice. And again, like I said back on that second slide, there is some review on this, and I really think it's a good idea if you do it before you start tackling adding and subtracting fractions. Okay, so you find that common denominator, express the fractions with it, so find that equivalent fraction, then you add or subtract based on whatever the sign happens to be in the middle, and reduce your answers to lowest terms if possible. So sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Okay, and the one other note to make is that for right now, as we're going through this, as we're first learning this adding and subtracting the fractions, keep all the fractions as improper fractions. Okay, adding in mixed fractions just adds an extra element of difficulty that we don't need to put in there just yet. We'll talk about it later, but we don't need to put it in there when we're first learning how to do this. It can be complicated enough as it is. Okay, so just keep everything improper. Okay. We'll apply that only to math, not to any other part of our lives where we talk about keeping things improper. Okay, so keep fractions improper. Now, so we'll go through these steps. So the common denominator here, and again, you can find this in many different ways, but I'll go through it fairly quickly. You can always pause it or go back to review it if you need to. You can multiply these two together to find 30 as the common denominator. Okay, there's nothing smaller. That will work better, so we'll stick with 30. So what you want to do then, as before, is you want to convert each fraction to a number over 30. Okay, so whatever you do to the bottom, you do to the top. All right, so if we did 5 times 6 to get to 30, we would do 2 times 6 to get 12. Okay, and for this second one here, 6 times 5 will get you 30, and so you do 1 times 5 to get you 5. And as we talked about in class and a few times before when we're doing this, please make sure that when you're seeing what you did to go from one number to another in a fraction, you are only multiplying and dividing, not adding. Okay, so for example, we could do 5 plus 25 to get 30, but if you applied that same thing to the top, then you have totally changed the fraction by the time you're done that. Okay, so we're only multiplying and dividing, not anything else. Okay, now that we've got a common denominator, you do exactly what we did on the first slide. So 12 plus 5 equals 17. So our final answer then is 17 over 30. There's no way to reduce that to lowest terms, so we just leave it right as it is. Yay. Okay, we'll try a few more examples just on the next page. All right, so 1/4 plus 3 over 16. First, we need to find that common denominator, which equals, in this case, equals 16. Okay, and there's a few different ways to calculate that out. That's why I wanted you to review it so we don't spend too much time in this video going over the finding of a common denominator part. Okay, so the 1/4, so we're converting these to something over 16, and so we would do 4 times 4 to get to 16. So we have to do 1 times 4 to get our numerator on the top. And if 16 is already the denominator here, so we don't have to change that one at all. So 4 over 16 plus 3 over 16 equals 7 over 16. Okay, which again, fortunately for us, is already in lowest terms, so nothing else we need to do with that. We are all done with that one. Okay, next, we need, again with these, you find common denominator first. Okay, and in this case, again, different ways of finding it, but you would multiply the two of them together to get a common denominator of 24. Okay, so over 24, right, like that. And in this particular problem, so whatever we did to the bottom, we do to the top as well. So 8 times 3 gets you 24. So you do 7 times 3 to get you 21. And 3 times 8 gets you 24. So you would do 1 times 8 to get you the top number. Now, I spoke in one of our meetings last week about another way to find those the numerators in these kinds of problems, which involves cross multiplication. If you know that way and you're comfortable with that way, then feel free to do that. I'm going to stick with this method for right now. Okay, now one important thing to note, although you want to find lowest terms with your final answer, you don't want to find lowest terms right here in this step. Okay, because if you do, it will just take you right back to the question you started with, and then you haven't really accomplished anything. So only lowest terms in the last step. Okay, so our answer then, always the same denominator once we've found the common one, and 21 minus 8 equals 13. And again, fortunately, it's already in lowest terms, so we're done. Remember to do whatever the symbol says, so that time it's subtraction, this time it's addition, so make sure you're doing whatever the right thing is depending on your question. Now, one other quick thing to note is if you were to find a different common denominator than the one I've used, that is absolutely okay. You will still be able to get the right answer. You'll just have slightly different question here. So just as an example, if on this top question we didn't notice that 16 was a common denominator, maybe you did 4 times 16 to get a common denominator of 64, which is also a common denominator of these numbers. Okay, so you would have your two numbers with denominators of 64. Your ending question here would have a denominator of 64, but what it means is that you would have to do some reducing to lowest terms. All right, so if you found the common denominator of 64, your answer here would actually have ended up being 28 over 64. Okay, if you use 64 as the common denominator here and here. But then this one, when you reduce it to lowest terms, will simply equal that right there. So you will end up with the same answer either way. I just prefer to keep the denominators as low as possible because it makes the math as easy as possible. Okay, so please make sure that as you're going through, you ask me lots of questions during our weekly video meetings and by email or whatever way is most convenient for you. Please try out the worksheets that I have given with these questions. There's a worksheet and a puzzle, and please make sure you try those. And like I said, we'll be continuing on a little bit more with this next week. Thank you very much.